The second base camp. The monsoon had broken, it was still raining when I awoke on the morning of June 28th. Yet breakfast appeared as usual. With the aptitude for overcoming apparently insuperable difficulties, Wangdi and Company had rigged a rough canopy of sacking over the hollow forming the kitchen. Some woods kept dry in their tent overnight had done for the rest. Further, to assist them, I gave them the jaconet outer cover of my sleeping bag. And this, when cut up and spread out, made an excellent waterproof canopy, some 6 feet square, beneath which the outer pieces of sacking culinary operations were carried out. I had decided before climbing the snow peak to shift my base camp to the floor of the valley. There were two reasons for this. Firstly, it would be central for botanical work, and secondly, the snow bridge beneath the camp was rapidly disintegrating. True, there was another snow bridge near the new camping site which would last a fortnight at least, but on the whole, the north side of the stream was more convenient. At 10 o'clock, the rain stopped and a watery sun appeared. I decided, however, to postpone moving the camp until the morrow in order to search the neighboring woods for plants. This work was delayed by the arrival of Pasang and the mail, and a local coolie carrying a mount about 80 pounds of coolie food. Among the mail was the Times special coronation supplement. The men were vastly intrigued with the pictures. That, I suppose, is your Potala, said Wangdi, pointing to a drawing of Westminster Abbey, and that is the king, and the Grand Lama is about to crown him. I agreed that the Archbishop of Canterbury was in fact a Grand Lama. Wangdi had already spoken to me about the abdication of Edward VIII. In spite of my limited knowledge of Urdu, I could follow him when he said that if a king was indeed a king, how is it that he cannot marry the woman of his choice? Either he does his work well or badly, and whom he marries is his own affair and his own choice. And what was woman to do with the kingship? I think this may be said to sum up the feeling of Indian people toward the abdication. Later in the morning, the men spotted a black bear on an elp across the valley. At first, in spite of Wangdi's pointing finger, I could not see it, and when I did, I needed my monocular glasses to confirm that a tiny black spot was indeed a bear. These Tibetans have eyes like hawks. It was 12 days since I had arrived in Bhayandar Valley, but time and the warm breath of the monsoon had wrought marvels to the flora. All around my tent were the nodding bells of Fritillaria royale and host of a white flowered onion, Allium humili, while on my rocky slope above the camp was a huge Megacarpia polyandra, with stately spires of yellow flowers that exuded a sweet musky smell. In the woods were many white Harmoniums, and I found another primula with a mealy purple flower which seemed to like the shade in a cool, mossy place under the rocks. Then there was a Clematis grata, not yet in flower, rambling over the bush of rhododendrons, and on a bank near the tents, a small shrub with charming bell like pink white flowers, which I learned later was Gaultheria, and another shrub with long spikes of bloom, which I found not for the life of me identified not even its family. Indeed, my ignorance was pitiable. I was like a cockney in a museum of precious things, only too eager and willing to acquire knowledge, but so confused and dazzled by the splendors about him as not to know how and where to start his quest. My sheet anchor was Dr. Ethelbert Blatter's book, Beautiful Flowers of Kashmir. It had been given to me by the great gardener, Mr. G. P. Baker, and was invaluable in helping me to identify a specimen. But even so, there were many occasions when I was not even able to relegate a flower to its family. However, when the worst came to the worst, I could always collect a specimen for my press and leave it to be named by the experts. The afternoon I spent wandering about the woods, where I found various ferns, including such homely species as the maidenhair and oak ferns. There is something blithesome and gay about a birch forest. It is not jealous of the sun or dank with rotting vegetation. I well remember a little glade in which I spent some time reclining on a bank with my back to a moss-clad boulder. It was an it was an absolutely still afternoon, for the warm breath of the monsoon seemed to have stifled the usual breeze. Above the tree tops, the peak showed dusted with freshly fallen snow between the woolly masses of cloud, and from all round came bird song. Close at hand, the notes of individual birds were discernible, and I heard from the Alp the grating trill of zither bird, but the songs of more distant birds were indistinguishable from a chorus that resembled played music very softly in vast cathedral. When I came out of the forest, I saw the lower slopes of the shelf dotted black and white. The sheep and the goats, which I had been expecting for the past few days, had arrived. I did not welcome them, for they would eat the flowers, but I comforted myself with the reflection that there are plenty of room in the Bhayandar valley and that they would be and where they could do comparatively little damage. Two of the shepherds called on us that evening and were entertained by the Tibetans. They were dressed in some dingy woolen material with a plaid of sackcloth over their shoulders. Their features were of a Semitic cast with well formed aquiline noses like most Garwalis. They had allowed their hair to grow long and had bobbed it in a becoming manner. Rain fell during the night and did not stop until after breakfast the next morning, when we packed up and moved the camp to the new site. A level meadow immediately above the stream, which had carved for itself a deep channel at this point. A short distance from the camp, a huge avalanche composed partly of ice had fallen from the wall of peaks to the north of the valley, and after pouring through a gully in the gently sloping floor of the valley, had spread itself across the stream to a depth of fully 50 feet. It had shrunk considerably during the past few weeks, for it had originally extended 300 yards down the stream after being bent at right angles from its original direction. This avalanche must have weighed many tens of thousands of tons, and the winds of it had snapped off short a number of birches along the edge of the meadow. There was an abundance of birch and juniper for fuel, while a few paces from the camp a stream of crystal clear water meandered down the gentle slope, then splashed over some rocks into a little flower filled valley. It was a beautiful camping place and, from a floral point of view, more interesting than the original base camp. The tents were pitched in the midst of the flower, prominent among which was the anemone polyanthus. In between grew thousands of yellow Nomocaris oxypelata, and here and there the blue Nomocaris nana. There was two kinds of geranium and a blue Delphinium brunianum. One of the loveliest of the taller plant was the Polymonium ceruleum, with a wide flattish flower of amethyst blue. The fritillaries were short-lived, and in their place potentialas were springing up in their millions. It was remarkable how one plant replaced another as the summer wore on. When the fritillaries were in bloom, it seemed impossible that anything else could grow. So closely packed were they. Yet they here were potentialas equally closely packed. Only an uninterrupted cycle of growth can maintain such perfect balance. Would it were possible to perfect this cycle in our gardens? It is not possible in a cultivated garden, where the balance is artificially maintained by constant weeding and thinning. But it may be possible in a wild garden provided that the cycle of growth and relationship of the plants one to the other are made in a scientific study. I believe that Rudolf Steiner had approached nearer to the problem than anyone. He had devoted his life to the study of rhythm in nature, and it is only through rhythm that harmony and beauty are achieved in the garden of flower or in the garden of human mind. I spent the afternoons pottering about the camp. The little valley of Knoll close by the camp were rich in plants, though it would be a fortnight or more before many of them bloomed. Close to the stream was the drift of blue cyanoglossom, and on the slope above the tall spires of starely pink flowered thistle like plant, subsequently identified as Morina longifolia. At the head of the little valley, to one side of the tumbling stream, was a overhanging rock, and under it glowed a single blue poppy, while on the steep bank above the river were many shrubs, including a pink rose and a bush of rhododendrons not more than 5 feet high, which edged the meadow with crimson flowers. Scarcely less colorful was a mass of Androsaceae primuloids, falling over a large boulder perched near the edge of dry and sunny bank, where various rock plants grew, including a yellow flowered saxifrage fragillaris, which scuds out long questing tendrils in all directions, and a little yellow potentilla eriocarpa. That evening, the men collected an abundance of firewood, which Nurbu arranged with a loving care. He is a connoisseur of campfires. Before the monsoon, I had need of a eider down jacket in the evening, but now it was unnecessary, for the air was warm and mild like an English July. I sat in my rickety camp chair, which had been artfully and indigenously repaired by Wang Di to prevent it falling into pieces, and read Shakespeare's sonnets. Which would what would he have written had he had been there that evening? What message would he have carried out from flowers, meadows, and dim forests? What language would he have garnered from the paling snows? When night fell, I continued to sit without reading, and the pale faces of anemones looked at me without moving out of the darkness. Rain fell in the night, but the next morning was fine. I was off at 8, taking with me Nurbu, who usually accompanied me on my botanical expeditions, and who had become expert at pressing flowers and rigging the camera. Furthermore, he took a genuine interest in the proceedings and often pointed out at a flower which he thought might interest me. The lush vegetation was wet, and soon we had soaked to the hips. On the floor of the valley, I saw nothing I had not seen before except ranunculus, but it was different tail on a buttress. We had mounted perhaps 500 feet without seeing anything of special interest when we came on a beautiful rose colored Cypripedium, which could be none other than the Cypripedium himalayacum mentioned by the Holsworth. This little flower fully earns its potential title of Lady Slipper, but it would be very small lady who could fit it to her foot. It is not more than 6 inches high, but there were so many that the slopes were imbued with rosy glow. Nearby I saw a white flower with a golden center and the end of the at the end of a single stem. I identify it as Lloydia serotina, which also found by Holsworth. This was an advance guard of millions which later covered the ground at the base camp. The red potentialas were now at their best, huge flowers the size of half crowns, and in between them was a purple orchis, which almost always grew in associated with thistles. Higher up we had a stiff scramble on some rocks where a near little draba ornamented the crevices and ledges, while a creeping knotweed was spreading over a weathered slab. Only a few sprays of Polygonium vexifolium were in bloom, but I saw it later in many places and came to the conclusion that it is one of the most beautiful of the Himalayan flowers. When fully bloomed, it cascades over the rocks in the rose colored flood and is visible from afar. We ate a lunch at Juniper Clad Ledge, 1500 feet beneath the camp, a cluster of minute tents, and beyond it the ragged, shining line of the stream. It was a typical monsoon day. Damp clouds were clinging to the peaks or suspended to a sky of watery blue, their shadows almost stationary on the green valley floor. Slate colored nimbus were gathering in the south as we ate. A dense mist oozed through the gorge into the upper part of the valley and congregated at the hillside above and below. We retired, but not in time to escape the rain, which fell with drenching force. It pierced until 8:30 when the stars shone out through an atmosphere sweet with wet turf and flowers. But this was only a temporary fine spell, and the rain set it in again later and fell without a pause until the late afternoon of the following day. There was nothing for me to do but lie in my sleeping bag, write up my botanical notes, read in between between while eat chocolates. This chocolate was remarkable, in as much as the makers presented, with each pack half a dozen pictures of film stars. Presumably, this was intended to increase sales. But unhappily, the Indian hot weather had caused the chocolate to sweat, and beauties like Greta Garbo, Betty Davis, Charles Lofton, and Al Jolson appeared a sadly debauched appearance. Among the papers I had received by mail were copies of Spectator and the Times. The news of the day was, as usual, depressing, but I got a certain amount of kick out of the literary reviews, especially as regards one book which the Times praised highly, and the Spectator damned to prediction perdition. Such contentious seemed to me symbolical of the distant combative world. Another paper, as illustrated weekly, told me with a wealth of detail and many diagrammatic drawings how to make an house gas proof. But it said nothing about tents. It all seemed utterly fantastic viewed from a valley of flowers. It was as though I was looking down on an ant heap which had gone completely crazy. The men and the women should have to know how they can make their houses gas proof before they can live at peace and charity with their neighbors. Is something so fantastic that the perpetrators of the joke should be locked up in asylum. I tried to explain the idea to Wang Di, but he looked at me so strangely that I desisted. The Belvedere's. The morning of July 2nd was overcast and grey, but I decided more for the sake of exercise than anything else to take a camp up towards the Kanta Khal Pass. From this pass, over which a route rise to the village of Hanuman Chatti in the Alaknanda Valley. A gentle sloping valley extends from distance before falling sharply into the Bayandar Valley. There is excellent grazing for sheep and goats, and a well defined track zigzags up a stream lower pitch in the valley by the side of the waterfall. I remembered the valley well as Holsworth had found many flowers there in 1931. There was little of floral interest to begin with, except that the edge of the birch forest was blue with cyanoglossom. But higher up there where the path emerged into the open upper part of the valley. The slopes were brilliant with flowers, and I found a Geum elatum, and the first Campanula cashmeriana. I had seen a small flower like the English harebell. There, then there was a collection of large boulders where I had come where I had come upon a fine display of blue poppies, each boulder affording shelter for one and in rare cases two plants. Even on that dull morning, they seemed to shine as though capable of retaining sunlight and blue skies of 2 days ago. At the back of my mind was the possibility of attempting a peak of about 20,000 feet to the north of the Kantakal Pass, but new snow had fallen during the recent bad weather, and now I realized that an attempt would have to be postponed until conditions improved. The alternative was to camp on a ridge to the south of the valley and on the morrow attempt the ascent of a rock peak of about 17,000 feet, which overlooks the gorge of the Bhayandar Valley. So we crossed the stream by convenient snowdrift and mounted slopes still bright with the blooms of the cream white rhododendrons, but had not got very far when rain fell heavily. The ridge for which we were making ends in a birch and rhododendron clad knoll overlooking the Bandar Valley. It was perfect belvedere, and I decided to camp on it. There was no close at hand, and the workers, where fires were concerned, somehow contrived to light the wet drop rhododendron's wood under a convenient overhanging boulder. At tea time, we were able to get a large fire going and dry out clothes, but the weather relapsed again later, and at 6 o'clock, torrential rainfall and had continued until after dark, when a perfect cloud burst descended. Never in my life I had camped in such rain, and I lay in my sleeping bag wondering whether the tent would be flattened beneath an apparently solid waterfall. To sleep was impossible, but shortly after midnight the rain ceased, leaving a calm atmosphere in which the roar of the swollen torrents sounded a deep chorus, broken by a peculiar rushing and tearing sound coming from the high waterfall on part of the rock peaks to the north side of the valley. The rain had fallen. The rain was falling when we woke next morning, but the sky was packed with moisture laden mist. The men had an uncomfortable night. They were usually adepts in the art of selecting a tent site, but on this occasion had chosen a hollow for their tent and had been flooded. It was some time before they could get a fire going, and the breakfast was a scratch affair. In such a weather, on such a weather, a long or difficult climb was out of the question, and I decided to ascend the ridge from the camp in search of flowers and turn back if and when difficulties were encountered. We were away before 7 and scrambled up to the ridge through dwarf rhododendrons and over big boulders. To judge from the amount of moss, this portion of Bhayandar Valley receives more rain than the upper portion. Doubtless, its proximity to the Alaknanda Valley has something to do with this. It all, at all events, there was a marked difference in the vegetation as compared with that of the upper end of the valley. Soon we came on a host of primulas of dark blue nivalis section, looking wonderfully fresh and clean after the rain. I found also a Codonopsis rodentifolia, many Virginias, which like a moist situation among rocks, and here and there GMs. Presently, after a scramble up some moss covered slabs, we reached a minor summit. Beyond it, the ridge crest consisted of enormous boulders piled upon one another with formidable drops on either side. We advanced cautiously and a few minutes later reached a slightly higher point. This was the end of the climb. For further progress was barred by a gap of fully 150 feet up deep, with vertical or overhanging slimy moss covering walls. In any event, there was little object in continuing farther, as once again the weather was spoiling, and dense mist already enveloped us. On this minor summit, I was interested to notice a round burn patch of grass. Lightning alone could have done this. Indeed, the rocks in the vicinity looked as though they had been frequently struck. Doubtless it was autosuggestion, but I had distinct feeling of electricity in my hair and beard, and as it was not very dark and we had not no wish to offer ourselves as lightning conductors, we descended to the camp. Nothing was to be gained by staying in a particular damp situation, so we packed up the sodden tents and descended. And as we descended, the weather, with that perverseness peculiar to the mountain weather, suddenly mended. The sun appeared, spilling brilliantly light on the birch forest, and in less than half an hour, the sky was almost unclouded and brilliantly blue. It was a scene to make a photographer mouth water. On high, the peaks dazzled, dazzlingly white in freshly fallen snow, beneath the emerald green valley and the green of the Irish landscape in springtime, and closer at the hand, the wet-leafed birch forest quivering and glancing with reflected light. Flowers were most beautiful after the rain, and I strolled down the hill, enchanted through drifts of blue cyanoglossom and regiments of pink knotty pausing only few minutes of photograph some new and intriguing composition of flower, forest, hillside and peak.